Rosie O'Donnell. Questions. John Kennedy's intelligence. His comeback is legendary. The stage of The View was set for what was supposed to be a routine discussion on education reform, a topic that had been dominating headlines and stirring passions across the nation. The studio buzzed with anticipation as the audience settled into their seats, their murmurs blending with the hum of overhead lights and the faint clatter of the crew adjusting cameras. The CO hosts, Whoopi Goldberg, Joy Behar, Sunny Hostin, and Sarah Haynes, sat poised at the iconic round table, their notes neatly arranged, ready to dive into the day's hot topic. The guest of honor was none other than Senator John Kennedy, the sharp-witted Republican from Louisiana, known for his folksy charm and incisive rhetoric. Opposite him as a guest co-host for the day was Rosie O'Donnell, the former talk show queen whose brash style and unfiltered opinions had made her a polarizing figure in Hollywood and beyond. The producers had booked Rosie knowing her presence would spark fireworks. But no one, not the crew, not the co-hosts, not even the audience, could have predicted the explosive collision that was about to unfold. What began as a standard policy debate would soon escalate into a battle of wits, with Rosie making a critical misstep that would set the stage for one of the most unforgettable moments in television history. As the show kicked off, the atmosphere was lively but controlled. Whoopi introduced the segment with her signature blend of gravitas and warmth, framing the discussion around the pressing need for education reform. She highlighted rising dropout rates, underfunded schools, and the growing demand for vocational training, setting the stage for a substantive conversation. Senator Kennedy, dressed in a crisp navy suit with a subtle red tie, leaned back in his chair, his posture relaxed, but his eyes alert like a seasoned debater sizing up the room. His southern drawl and easy smile belied a mind honed by years of navigating the cutthroat world of politics. Rosie, on the other hand, exuded restless energy. Her hands fidgeted with her note cards, and her expression oscillated between a forced smile and a barely concealed smirk. She had a reputation for diving headfirst into debates, often with more passion than precision, and today seemed no different. The audience sensed the contrast between the two guests. Immediately, Kennedy's calm confidence versus Rosie's barely restrained intensity. It was a recipe for tension, and the room seemed to hold its breath as the discussion began. Kennedy was invited to speak first, and he didn't disappoint. With a disarming grin, he launched into a clear, concise explanation of his proposed education reform bill, which aimed to increase federal funding for public schools while giving states more flexibility to tailor curricula to local needs. His voice carried the cadence of a Southern storyteller, weaving anecdotes about rural Louisiana classrooms with hard data on graduation rates and teacher shortages. He spoke of a high school in Shreveport, where students had built a solar-powered car, using it as an example of what kids could achieve with the right resources. The audience nodded along, captivated by his ability to make a complex issue feel personal and urgent. Even Joy Behar, known for her skeptical quips, seemed impressed, jotting down notes as Kennedy spoke. Sunny Hostin leaned forward, her legal mind clearly engaged by his emphasis on equity and funding. For a moment, it seemed the segment would stay on track, a rare moment of bipartisan clarity on a show known for its heated exchanges. But Rosie O'Donnell had other plans. As Kennedy wrapped up his opening remarks, she leaned forward abruptly, her chair creaking under the sudden movement. Without waiting for Whoopi to moderate, she cut in, her voice sharp and laced with condescension. "Hold on, Senator. Hold on," she said, waving a hand, as if dismissing a pesky fly. "All this talk about flexibility and local needs sounds real nice, but let's be honest. Do you really think the average person out there gets what you're saying? I mean, You're throwing around all these policy buzzwords like you're some kind of expert." The studio fell silent, the audience caught off guard by the abrupt shift in tone. Kennedy's eyebrows raised slightly, but his smile didn't waver. He tilted his head as if inviting her to continue his expression, one of polite curiosity. Rosie, emboldened by the silence, pressed on. "I'm just saying, Senator, you're from Louisiana, right? A lot of folks might think you're just a simple Southern guy trying to sound smarter than you are. Maybe stick to what you know." The words landed like a slap, and a few audience members gasped audibly. Sonny Hostin's eyes widened, and Sarah Haynes shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Even Whoopi, usually unflappable, looked momentarily stunned, her hand pausing mid-gesture. The comment was a clear jab, not just at Kennedy's expertise, but at his identity as a Southerner, a stereotype Rosie wielded with reckless confidence. It was the kind of personal attack that could derail a segment, turning a policy discussion into a shouting match. The other show hosts exchanged glances, clearly unsure how to steer the conversation back on track. Joy Behar opened her mouth to interject, but before she could, Kennedy chuckled a low, warm sound that seemed to diffuse the tension for a split second. "Well, Rosie," he began, his drawl slow and deliberate, "I appreciate your concern for my vocabulary, but I reckon the folks back home in Louisiana understand me just fine when I talk about their kids' schools." The audience laughed, a ripple of relief spreading through the room. It was a masterfully light response, sidestepping the insult while subtly asserting his connection to his constituents. But Rosie wasn't laughing. Her face tightened, her lips pursing as if she'd tasted something sour. She hadn't expected Kennedy to brush off her jab so effortlessly, and it seemed to irritate her more than if he'd snapped back. Undeterred, Rosie doubled down. "Look, Senator, I've been around these kinds of discussions a long time," she said, her voice rising. "I've talked to teachers, parents, activists, you name it, and I'm not sure you're really grasping the complexity of this issue. Education reform isn't just about throwing money at schools and calling it a day. Maybe you're a little out of your depth here." The accusation hung in the air, heavy and provocative. It wasn't just a challenge to Kennedy's policy, it was a direct assault on his intelligence delivered with a patronizing tone that made even the most neutral audience members wince. The camera zoomed in on Kennedy, capturing the faintest twitch of his jaw, before his smile returned wider this time. "Is that so, Rosie?" he asked, his voice deceptively soft. "Well, I'm always happy to learn something new. Why don't you tell me where I'm going wrong?" The invitation was polite, almost gentlemanly, but there was a glint in his eyes that suggested he was laying a trap. The audience leaned forward, sensing the shift in energy. This wasn't just a debate anymore, it was a showdown. Rosie, oblivious to the danger, took the bait. She launched into a rambling critique of Kennedy's bill, claiming it ignored the needs of urban schools and relied too heavily on standardized testing. Her points were vague, more emotional than factual, and she gestured wildly as she spoke, as if sheer volume could compensate for her lack of specifics. Kennedy listened intently, his hands folded calmly on the table, nodding occasionally as if considering her words. When she finally paused, out of breath, he tilted his head again and said, "That's an interesting take, Rosie. But I'm curious, can you point me to the part of my bill that says we're ignoring urban schools, 'cause I must have missed that in the 200 pages I helped write?" The audience chuckled again, louder this time, and Rosie's cheeks flushed. She fumbled with her notes, clearly unprepared for the question. "Well, it's implied," she stammered. "You know the whole state flexibility thing, it's just code for letting big cities fend for themselves." Kennedy's smile widened. "Code, huh? That's a mighty big assumption. Maybe we ought to stick to what's actually on the page before we start cracking secret codes." The laughter from the audience was now unmistakable, and even Whoopi cracked a smile, though she quickly raised a hand to regain control. The exchange had shifted the dynamic in the studio. Rosie's initial aggression was starting to backfire, her broad attacks no match for Kennedy's precise, good-humored deflections. But she wasn't ready to back down, not yet. During a brief commercial break, as the crew adjusted lighting and the co-hosts sipped water, Rosie could be seen whispering to a producer, her gestures animated, and her expression one of frustration. Kennedy, meanwhile, chatted quietly with Sarah Haynes, his demeanor as relaxed as if he were at a backyard barbecue. The audience murmured among themselves, some whispering about Rosie's tone, others marveling at Kennedy's composure. When the cameras rolled again, Whoopi tried to steer the conversation back to policy, asking Kennedy to elaborate on how his bill would support teachers. He began to answer, outlining a provision for professional development programs, when Rosie interrupted again. "Senator," with all due respect, she said, though her tone suggested anything but respect. "You're talking about teacher training like it's some magic fix. I've been in this business longer than you've been in Washington, and I can tell you people want real solutions, not more talk." The dig was personal, implying Kennedy was a newcomer to the national stage despite his years in public service. The audience tensed, sensing the conversation was about to take another sharp turn. Kennedy didn't miss a beat. "Rosie, I reckon you've been in show business a good while, and you're darn good at it," he said, his tone warm but pointed. "But when it comes to fixin' schools, I'd say the teachers I've met in Baton Rouge know a thing or two about what works, and they're telling me training helps. Now, if you've got a better idea, I'm all ears." The response was a masterclass in redirection, acknowledging Rosie's experience while firmly reasserting his own authority. The audience erupted in applause, and Sonny Hostin nodded approvingly. Rosie's face reddened, her hands gripping her note cards so tightly they crinkled. She opened her mouth to respond, but Kennedy wasn't done. "And just so we're clear," he added, his voice still light, but with a steel edge, "I've been in Washington long enough to know that real solutions start with listening to folks, not talking over 'em." The studio exploded in cheers, the loudest of the day, and even Joy Behar clapped, her usual skepticism replaced by admiration. Rosie, for the first time, looked genuinely rattled, her usual bravado faltering under the weight of Kennedy's quick wit and the audience's reaction. The segment was nearing its end, but the tension was far from resolved. Rosie's initial jab had spiraled into a full-blown confrontation, and her attempts to undermine Kennedy had only made him shine brighter. The TO hosts, sensing the need to wrap up, began to pivot to lighter questions, but Rosie's expression suggested she wasn't ready to let go. She leaned forward again, her voice lower but no less aggressive. "Senator, I'm just trying to keep it real here," she said. "You're making it sound like you've got all the answers, but education's complicated. Maybe you're not seeing the big picture." It was her final gambit, a last attempt to paint Kennedy as out of touch. The audience held its breath, waiting for his response. Kennedy leaned back, his smile now almost mischievous. "Rosie, I don't claim to have all the answers," he said, "but I do know this: you don't fix a broken system by assuming you know more than the folks living in it. And if you think I'm missing the big picture, I'd love to hear your plan. Lay it on me." The challenge was clear, and the ball was firmly in Rosie's court. The studio was silent, every eye on her, waiting to see if she could rise to the occasion or if she just handed Kennedy the opening he needed to seal his victory. As the segment cut to commercial, the audience erupted in applause, sensing they'd just witnessed the opening act of something extraordinary. Backstage, producers scrambled to discuss how to handle the escalating drama, while the co-hosts exchanged whispered comments, their faces a mix of awe and apprehension. Kennedy sat calmly sipping water, his expression one of quiet satisfaction. Rosie, meanwhile, stared at her notes, her jaw tight, clearly regrouping for the next round. The stage was set for a battle that would only intensify with Kennedy's wit and preparation poised to meet Rosie's aggression head-on. Little did she know, her decision to challenge the senator's intelligence was about to backfire in a way that would echo far beyond the walls of the studio, setting the stage for a comeback that would be nothing short of legendary. The commercial break ended, and the studio lights of The View snapped back on, casting a sharp glow over the round table where tension still simmered. The audience, now fully invested, leaned forward in their seats, their earlier applause replaced by an electric anticipation. The CO hosts, Whoopi Goldberg, Joy Behar, Sunny Hostin, and Sarah Haynes, adjusted their notes, their expressions a mix of professionalism and barely concealed curiosity about what would happen next. Senator John Kennedy sat with the same relaxed posture, his hands loosely clasped his face, wearing a faint, almost mischievous smile that suggested he was ready for whatever came his way. Across from him, Rosie O'Donnell gripped her note cards tightly, her earlier confidence shaken, but not gone. Her eyes darted between Kennedy and the audience as if calculating her next move. The first segment had been a wake-up call. Her attempts to undermine the senator had backfired, met with his quick wit and the audience's enthusiastic support. But Rosie wasn't one to retreat. If anything, the setback seemed to fuel her determination to reclaim control. What she didn't realize was that she was walking into a trap of her own making, and Kennedy was about to deliver a masterclass in intellectual precision that would leave her scrambling and the audience in awe. Whoopi, sensing the need to regain some semblance of order, opened the second segment with a neutral question, directing it at Kennedy. "Senator, you mentioned your bill focuses on giving states more flexibility," she said, her voice steady. "Can you break down how that would work for, say, a struggling school district in a big city like New York?" It was a fair question, designed to refocus the discussion on policy and give Kennedy a chance to elaborate. He nodded, leaning forward slightly, his southern drawl as warm as ever. "Happy to Whoopi," he began. "Take a place like New York. A lot of their schools are dealing with overcrowded classrooms and not enough teachers who specialize in things like math or science. My bill sets up a block grant system. Fancy term, I know, but it just means the federal government sends money to the states, and local folks decide how to spend it. In New York, that might mean hiring more STEM teachers or fixing up old buildings. The point is, the people who know those kids best get to call the shots, not some bureaucrat in Washington." His explanation was clear, grounded in practical examples, and delivered with a folksy charm that made the audience nod along. Even Sarah Haynes, usually reserved, smiled and scribbled a note, clearly impressed by his ability to distill a complex idea. But before Kennedy could finish, Rosie interjected, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. "Senator, that's all well and good, but you're making it sound so simple," she said, her tone dripping with skepticism. "You're talking about block grants like there's some magic bullet. But what about accountability? How do we know states won't just waste that money? I mean, no offense, but you're from Louisiana. Your state's not exactly known for managing education funds wisely." The jab was pointed not just at Kennedy's policy, but at his home state, and it drew a few sharp inhales from the audience. Sunny Hostin's eyebrows shot up, and Joy Behar leaned back, her lips pursed, as if bracing for impact. Rosie's comment was a bold escalation, moving beyond questioning Kennedy's ideas to implying he was complicit in his state's shortcomings. It was a risky move, one that could either rally the audience to her side or alienate them entirely. The studio grew quiet, every eye on Kennedy, waiting to see how he'd respond to the personal attack. Kennedy didn't flinch. Instead, he let out a soft chuckle, the kind you'd hear from a teacher amused by a student's overconfidence. "Rosie, you're right about one thing," Education's not simple, he said, his voice steady, but with a sharper edge than before. But let's talk about accountability since you brought it up. My bill includes a provision for annual audits by the Department of Education, plus public reporting requirements so folks can see exactly where every dollar goes. Now, as for Louisiana, we've had our challenges, no question. But last year, our graduation rate hit 84%, up from 78% 5 years ago. That's not perfect, but it's progress, and it's because we're listening to teachers and parents, not just writing blank checks. The audience clapped, impressed by his command of the facts and his refusal to take the bait. Rosie's face tightened, her earlier smirk replaced by a flicker of unease. She hadn't expected Kennedy to counter with specifics, and her attempt to paint him as out of touch was starting to unravel. Undeterred, Rosie pressed harder, her voice rising as she tried to regain the upper hand. "Look, Senator, I'm not saying you don't care about kids," she said, though her tone suggested otherwise, "but this whole states know best thing feels like a cop-out. Education's a national issue, and we need national standards. You're sitting here talking about audits and grants. But are you really qualified to be leading this charge? I mean, with all due respect, you're a politician, not an educator." The accusation was her boldest, yet a direct challenge to Kennedy's credentials and intelligence. The audience gasped, and Sarah Haynes put a hand to her mouth, clearly uncomfortable with the personal turn. Whoopi raised a hand to intervene, but Kennedy waved it off gently, his eyes locked on Rosie. "Oh, I'm happy to have this conversation, Rosie," he said, his smile now carrying a hint of steel. "Since you're so curious about qualifications, let's dive in." The studio went silent, the tension so thick it seemed to hum. Kennedy's calm demeanor was deceptive, like the still water hiding a strong current, and Rosie had just stepped into the deep end. Kennedy leaned forward, his hands gesturing lightly as he spoke each word, measured but piercing. "You're right, Rosie. I'm not a teacher. Never claimed to be. But I've spent years talking to educators, from preschool teachers in New Orleans to college professors in Baton Rouge. I've sat in classrooms, read the studies, and worked with folks on both sides of the aisle to get this bill right. Now you mentioned national standards. Fair point. But did you know the last time we tried a one-size-fits-all approach back with no child left behind, it led to schools teaching to the test? Instead of teaching kids to think, dropout rates in cities like Chicago went up, not down. My bill's based on data showing local control with guardrails gets better results." The audience erupted in applause, stunned by his ability to pivot from a personal attack to a policy masterclass. Rosie blinked, clearly thrown by the depth of his response. She opened her mouth to interrupt, but Kennedy wasn't done. "And since we're talking qualifications," he added, his tone still polite, but now laced with a quiet intensity. "I'm curious, what's your background in education policy? 'Cause I'd love to hear your take on how we fix this mess." The question landed like a thunderbolt. Rosie froze, her note cards forgotten, as the camera zoomed in on her stunned expression. The audience murmured some chuckling at the audacity of Kennedy's counter. Joy Behar let out a low whistle, and Sunny Hostin nodded, her legal mind clearly appreciating the precision of the move. Rosie scrambled to respond, her voice faltering. "Well, I've talked to a lot of people," she said. "I've been on TV talking about issues like this for years. I've got kids, I know what parents go through." It was a weak defense, and the audience's silence spoke volumes. Kennedy tilted his head, his smile almost sympathetic. "Talking about issues is important, Rosie," he said. "But fixing 'em takes more than a microphone. It takes sitting down with folks who've spent their lives in classrooms, crunching the numbers, and writing laws that actually work. That's what I'm trying to do." The applause was deafening, the loudest of the day, and even Whoopi clapped, her usual neutrality giving way to admiration. Rosie, now visibly flustered, tried to pivot. "Okay, Senator, but let's be real," she said, her voice tinged with desperation. "Your bill sounds like it's just kicking the can down the road. You're saying states should handle it, but what about kids in states that don't prioritize education?" "You're dodging the tough questions." It was a last-ditch effort to paint Kennedy as evasive, but it only gave him another opening. He leaned back, his eyes twinkling with the confidence of someone who'd anticipated every move. "Dodgin' questions, Rosie. I'm right here answering yours," he said, drawing laughter from the crowd. "But since you're worried about kids in struggling states, let's look at the numbers. My bill sets a baseline. Every state has to meet federal benchmarks for literacy and math, or they lose funding. That's not dodging responsibility. That's holding folks accountable. And just so you know, I got that idea from a principal in Monroe who's been fighting for her kids for 30 years. Who's your source on this one?" The audience roared, and Rosie's face turned crimson. She fumbled for a response, but her words came out jumbled, a stark contrast to Kennedy's clarity. Sensing her moment slipping away, Rosie made a critical mistake. She went for a personal jab again. "Senator, you're good at talking. I'll give you that," she said, her voice tight. "But I remember you giving a speech a while back saying something about education being a local issue. That's not leadership, that's passing the buck. I saw it on TV and I thought, this guy's just playing to his base." The accusation was meant to sting, painting Kennedy as a politician more concerned with votes than solutions. But it was a miscalculation, and Kennedy's eyes lit up as if she'd just handed him a gift. "Rosie, I'm glad you're watching my speeches," he said, his tone playful but pointed. "But you got that one a little wrong. What I said was, education's a local priority, but it's a national responsibility. Big difference. I've been pushing for federal support since day one, but I believe folks on the ground know their kids better than a desk in D.C. And if you'd watched the whole speech, you'd know I proposed a $2 billion pilot program for vocational schools. Sound like passing the buck to you?" The audience exploded in cheers, and even the crew members exchanged impressed glances. Rosie's jaw dropped, her attempt to catch Kennedy off guard, now a humiliating misstep. Kennedy wasn't done. He reached for a folder in front of him, pulling out a single sheet of paper with a flourish that was both theatrical and deliberate. "Since we're talking about getting things right," he said, his voice now carrying a quiet authority, "I brought a little something to help us out. Rosie, you mentioned earlier that states like mine waste education money. That's a strong claim, but I checked, and last year you were on a talk show saying the federal government spends trillions on education every year. Trillions, Rosie. Actual number, about $80 billion. Now, I ain't a math teacher, but that's off by a couple zeros." The studio erupted in laughter, the loudest yet, and Rosie's face went pale. Kennedy held up the paper showing a transcript of her quote, and the camera zoomed in, capturing the moment for posterity. "I'm not trying to pick a fight," he added, his tone almost apologetic. "But if we're going to talk about wasting money, let's start with getting our facts straight." The applause was thunderous, and Whoopi raised both hands, signaling for calm as the segment neared its end. Rosie sat stunned, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched her note cards. She tried to muster a comeback, but her words were drowned out by the audience's cheers. Kennedy, meanwhile, leaned back in his chair, his smile now one of quiet satisfaction. The CO host scrambled to wrap up the segment with Joy Behar tossing in a light-hearted quip about needing a fact-checker on speed dial. But the damage was done. Rosie's aggressive tactics had crumbled against Kennedy's preparation and poise, and the audience knew it. As the cameras cut to commercial, the studio buzzed with excitement, audience members whispering about the senator's performance. Backstage producers huddled, their voices a mix of panic and awe, as they debated how to handle the fallout. Rosie stared at the table, her earlier bravado replaced by a dawning realization that she'd underestimated her opponent. Kennedy, ever the gentleman, sipped his water and exchanged a quick word with Sonny Hostin, his demeanor as calm as if he'd just finished a friendly chat. The stage was set for the final act, where the consequences of this clash would ripple outward. But for now, Kennedy had firmly taken control, proving that when it came to wit and wisdom, he was a force to be reckoned with. The final segment of The View began with the studio lights casting a crisp glow over the round table where the air crackled with anticipation. The audience, still reeling from the intellectual showdown between Senator John Kennedy and Rosie O'Donnell, sat on the edge of their seats, their murmurs blending with the soft hum of the cameras. The CEO hosts, Whoopi Goldberg, Joy Behar, Sonny Hostin, and Sarah Haynes, exchanged quick glances, their expressions a mix of professionalism and quiet astonishment at the drama they'd witnessed. Senator Kennedy, his navy suit unruffled, leaned back in his chair with a serene confidence, his faint smile hinting at the mastery he'd displayed in dismantling Rosie's attacks. Across from him, Rosie O'Donnell clutched her note cards, her face a mask of forced composure, though her tense posture betrayed her unease. The audience, now firmly in Kennedy's corner, watched her closely, curious to see if she could recover from her earlier missteps. What unfolded was not just the conclusion of a heated debate, but a profound moment of resolution, one that would leave a lasting impact, offering lessons in resilience, respect, and the enduring power of preparation that would echo far beyond the studio walls. Whoopi, ever? The steady hand opened the segment with a deliberate calm, her voice cutting through the tension. "All right, let's wrap this up with some clarity," she said, her tone warm but firm. "Senator Kennedy, you've given us a lot on your education reform bill, and we've had a spirited exchange." The audience chuckled softly, appreciating her diplomacy. "Rosie, you've raised some points about accountability. Anything you'd like to add before we close?" It was a generous opening, a chance for Rosie to pivot to substance, or at least exit gracefully. The camera lingered on her, capturing the flicker of doubt in her eyes. For a brief moment, it seemed she might take the high road, offering a reasoned critique, or acknowledging the senator's points. But Rosie, stung by her earlier setbacks, and driven by a need to reclaim her footing, chose a path that would cement her defeat and elevate Kennedy's performance to iconic status. Rosie leaned forward, her voice tight with defiance. "Whoopi, I'm just keeping it honest," she said, her words clipped. "The senator's bill sounds good, but it's still too loose. We need hard rules, not just promises that states will figure it out. And no offense, Senator, but I'm not sure you're the one to fix this. You're a politician, not someone who's lived the education system." The attack echoed her earlier jabs, but it lacked conviction, coming off as a tired rehash rather than a fresh challenge. The audience shifted uncomfortably, some exchanging skeptical looks, sensing Rosie's desperation. It was a critical error, a refusal to engage with Kennedy's detailed arguments, and it handed him the perfect opportunity to close the debate with authority. Kennedy tilted his head, his smile carrying a trace of empathy, as if he regretted the necessity of what was to come. "Rosie, I respect your honesty," he began, his southern drawl as warm as ever, "but if you're calling my bill loose, I'd love to tighten it up for you. Let's talk specifics." The audience leaned in their applause, soft but eager, ready for another display of his command. Kennedy reached for his folder, pulling out a single page from his education reform bill with a deliberate ease that drew every eye. He held it briefly, letting the camera catch the official letterhead before setting it down. "Here's the meat of it," he said, his voice clear and steady. "My bill earmarks $8 billion for teacher training over 4 years targeting shortages in subjects like science and reading. It sets up a grant system for schools to pilot programs, say robotics clubs or carpentry classes, for kids who want to work with their hands. And on accountability, since that's your concern, Rosie, it requires states to publish every dollar spent online so folks can see if their school's getting a fair shake. That, loose enough for you, the audience erupted in cheers, the sound swelling as Kennedy leaned back, his point delivered with precision. Sunny Hostin nodded vigorously, her legal mind clearly impressed by his clarity. Joy Behar clapped lightly, her usual skepticism replaced by admiration. Rosie, caught off guard by the specifics, stammered, "That's a step, but I still think it's not enough." Her words were lost in the applause, her attempt to counter falling flat. Kennedy, sensing the moment, pressed his advantage with a grace that made his dominance all the more striking. "Rosie, you mentioned I'm not in the education system." He continued, his tone polite but firm. "You're right, I'm not a teacher, but I've spent years sitting with folks who are. Principals in Shreveport, parents in Monroe, kids who just need a shot. They're the ones who built this bill, not me dreaming it up in some office. So I'm curious, when's the last time you talked policy with a teacher, 'cause their ideas might surprise you?" The question was a quiet thunderclap delivered with such charm that its sharpness took a moment to register. The audience gasped, then cheered, recognizing the deftness of his counter. Rosie's face reddened, her hands fumbling with her cards. "I've talked to people," she said, her voice thin. "I've got kids, I know the system." But her response lacked weight, and the audience's silence spoke volumes. Kennedy nodded almost kindly, but his eyes held a glint of resolve. He had her on the ropes, and he wasn't about to let up. The CO hosts, sensing the segment's intensity, tried to pivot. Sarah Haynes tossed in a question about rural schools, but Rosie, now visibly shaken, interrupted one last time. "Senator, you're smooth, I'll give you that," she said, her voice trembling with frustration. "But this is just talk. People need real action, not another politician's promises." It was a final desperate swing, but it lacked the fire of her earlier attacks. Kennedy's smile widened, and he leaned forward, his voice now carrying a quiet authority. "Rosie, I ain't here to make promises I can't keep," he said. "I'm here to get results. And if you think that's just talk, maybe try listening to the folks who live this every day. Teachers, kids, parents. They're the ones we're working for, not the ones keeping score on TV." The studio exploded in applause, the loudest yet, and even Whoopi joined in, shaking her head in awe. Rosie sat back, her shoulders slumping, her defeat unmistakable. As the segment ended, Whoopi wrapped up with her usual finesse. "Senator, you've given us plenty to chew on," she said, her tone warm. "Rosie, thanks for your input. This is why we do this real talk, real ideas." But the audience's focus was on Kennedy, who nodded humbly, his work complete. As the cameras cut to commercial, Rosie stood abruptly, muttering about needing air, and left the set, her exit swift and quiet. The audience whispered among themselves, some noting her departure, others praising Kennedy's poise. Backstage producers huddled, their voices a mix of excitement and concern, as they realized they'd captured a historic moment. Kennedy stayed at the table chatting with Joy Behar about her latest book, his demeanor as calm as if he'd just finished a friendly coffee chat. The contrast was stark, Rosie's retreat versus Kennedy's steady presence, a testament to his resilience under fire. When the show returned, Rosie was absent. Whoopi addressed it briefly. Rosie had to step out, but we appreciate her joining us. The audience exchanged knowing looks, and Kennedy, ever gracious, focused on a final question about teacher retention, answering with the same clarity and warmth. As the show ended, the audience rose in a standing ovation, their applause a tribute to his performance. Backstage, a crew member remarked, "That was like watching a lion tame a storm." Unreal. The sentiment spread online within minutes as clips of the exchange went viral. The hashtag Kennedy Shines trended with thousands of posts praising his wit and composure. Rosie tried to come for him, but Kennedy was untouchable, one user wrote. Another added, "That's how you handle a debate facts class," and a smile. News outlets ran stories with headlines like "Senator Kennedy's viral view moment" and "Rosie O'Donnell's debate misstep sparks praise for Senator." The consequences were immediate. Kennedy's profile soared with speaking invitations flooding in from schools, civic groups, and policy forums eager to hear from the senator who'd turned a personal attack into a policy showcase. His education reform bill gained traction with new supporters citing his ability to articulate its value under pressure. Rosie, meanwhile, faced backlash. Her social media post, "Lively debate on The View today. Always good to mix it up," drew sharp replies with users calling out her lack of preparation. "Mixing it up doesn't mean getting schooled," one wrote. Her visibility dipped with planned appearances quietly shelved as producers distanced themselves from the controversy. The incident became a teaching tool used in communication workshops to illustrate how to handle hostile exchanges with dignity and evidence. The true power of the moment lay in its lessons, which reached far beyond the studio. Kennedy's performance showed that preparation is the bedrock of any serious debate. His success came not from flash, but from hours spent studying, listening, and refining his ideas. His calm in the face of aggression highlighted the strength of emotional discipline, proving that you can win without stooping to insults. Most crucially, the exchange underscored the need for respect in discourse. Rosie's error was not just her factual missteps, but her assumption that she could dismiss someone's expertise without earning the right. Kennedy, by contrast, never belittled her even when provoked, letting his knowledge and character shine. For students, professionals, and anyone facing unfair criticism, his example was a guide. Know your work, stay steady, and let your actions speak. Schools began using the clip in civics lessons, urging young people to emulate his approach. The phrase, "do a Kennedy," emerged a nod to handling challenges with grace and precision. The View's stage had been a proving ground, but its lessons were universal, reminding all that in a world of noise, the quiet power of preparation and respect can change the conversation.